Today's case discusses the disappearance of a man I can best describe as quirky, lovable, and brilliant. He loved to study creatures that most of us find creepy if not dangerous, primarily venomous snakes and spiders. He made a career for himself as a spider expert, and he and his sister actually named a spider commonly found in the Pacific Northwest. His research and side hobbies took up most of his time, but lest you think he was just a nerdy introvert, he was very social. And he got some of his social time in as a weekly regular at a local watering hole, cleaning up at trivia and drinking beer. That night in June of 1999 was just like that, except that on this night, he didn't make it home. What happened when he walked out of that Idaho Falls bar that night remains as much a mystery 25 years later as it did back then. Did he fall into the nearby river? Did he meet with foul play? With either of those scenarios, the main questions remain. What happened? Why or how? And most of all, where did he end up? My name is Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved, mysterious disappearance of Darwin Vest. Darwin Kenneth Vest was born on April 22, 1951. He lived his life all over the northwest quadrant of the United States. From the time he was young, Darwin had a scientific brain, and he took up a huge interest in studying creatures most of us squirm about: spiders, snakes, scorpions, and the like. Darwin never officially went to school for this line of study. Everything he learned was self-taught, or taught to him alongside his professional acquaintances at different universities whom he befriended. His friends would later recall, though, that he had the type of brain that would retain everything. They would stumble into a certain spider or creature, and he would know the Latin name for it off the top of his head. Darwin's real focus was on the toxicology of venomous snakes, spiders, and plants. So much so that if you look him up, you will see him referred to as a toxicologist, and despite being a mostly self-taught scientist, he was known as an expert. He went on the Discovery Channel for interviews. He was an expert witness in court cases about insect and spider bites all over the country, and he did lectures at colleges. The way he would study spider venom was by milking the venom out of the spider, and the process does make me feel a little sad for the spider, even being a total arachnophobe myself. He apparently would anesthetize the spider and then scotch tape it to a board. He would then shock the spider so that a drop of venom would come out, and he would pick it up with a pipette, the venom that would drop out. The study of venom and the nuances in bites and venom between different spiders really gave him his claim to fame, which was identifying and naming a spider that had only recently made its way to the Pacific Northwest. You see, many people there were getting bit by a household spider, and some people were having pretty serious reactions. Because of the appearance of the spiders that were in that area, people were thinking that they were maybe being bitten by a brown recluse spider, which is a well-known, highly poisonous spider found in parts of the United States. But the key word here is parts of the United States. No further west than Nebraska. So these bites in Oregon and Washington and Idaho and Utah, they could not be the work of the brown recluse. Vest and his sister Rebecca, who also liked to study things similar to him, identified and named the hobo spider. The hobo spider is a member of the funnel web spider family. It originated in Europe and then became an invasive species in the Pacific Northwest. They make their way into homes primarily in August through October, and they have a tendency to look a lot like other brown spiders. And so those who work in, the spider field, I'll call it, will say that if you aren't doing the work they're doing, you're likely not going to be able to identify it. Darwin and Rebecca named this spider the hobo spider because it was commonly found alongside railroad tracks, and that's actually partially how the spiders moved around and spread inland. But besides just naming the spider, Darwin was known for claiming the bite was venomous and caused skin necrosis, which is the death of tissue in the bite area. He studied several cases of it and conducted lab experiments on rabbits. Vest went on to share a lot of these findings in the early 90s. In an interview with the Spokesman Review in Spokane, Washington, Vest talked all about hobo spiders. Vest said that the hobo spider began appearing in Idaho in the 60s and 70s. For a while, there was a steep increase in growth, but by the mid-90s, the population had remained steady for over 10 years. Nothing was really happening to the spiders, it's just that they were kind of spreading outward into more agricultural communities. At that time, Darwin recommended using sticky traps to catch them versus spraying for them in your house because spraying unfortunately kills their natural enemies. Speaking of which, because they were an invasive species, they didn't have a whole lot of enemies in the Pacific Northwest. In fact, the hobo spiders were coming into homes and killing the regular house spiders and taking over their webs. So Vest looked into what hunted hobo spiders over in Europe, and it turns out it's called the giant house spider. And that's what kept the hobo spider population down in Europe. And guys, I need you to know that scientists tried to introduce this giant house spider in the Idaho area because its bite was not toxic to humans. And apparently the giant house spider said, "No thanks, I don't like your dry desert areas here in Idaho," and so the population didn't take off there. And given that apparently they are 3 times the size of the already too big, in my opinion, hobo spiders, I'm also saying no thanks. Do not introduce that here to the United States. Absolutely not. Also, I'm too scared to Google any more information about if they've actually found their way here after all these years, and just don't tell me. I don't want to know. I want to live my life pretending that these are in Europe. Okay, moving on. Darwin Vest had actually created such a stir with his spider research that he made it into the punchline of a joke of Jay Leno's. It was during the O.J. Simpson trial, and Leno reportedly said that Darwin Vest reported that the hobo spider had killed 2 people, but that it was no big deal because O.J. Simpson had killed that many too. In 1999, Darwin lived with his mother, Margaret, in Idaho Falls. He had moved back to the area in the last several years because he felt it gave him the opportunity to care for her so that she could age in place in her own home. Prior to that, Darwin had spent over a decade in Moscow, Idaho, where he spent a lot of time at the University of Washington. Again, he wasn't an official student there, but he used to study alongside other scientists there and read a lot of textbooks and was always in the labs there, conducting experiments right alongside them. When he wasn't doing that, he was a film projectionist at a tiny movie theater called the Micro Movie House. He became so well known at the university and the theater and within that community of Moscow as the spider guy that a former colleague talked about how people would come into the theater and just say, "I need to show Darwin my bite, I need him to look at it." Or they would catch a house spider and bring it to him to identify and study. After moving back to Idaho Falls, Darwin founded his own research center with his sister, Rebecca, called the Eagle Rock Research Center. He would also take his show on the road doing tours with venomous snakes and spiders and creatures. And his friend said he would very often walk around town and go to try to find snakes and spiders, lifting up rocks and frequenting their habitats. Now, just a quick side note, much of Darwin's research has been debunked specifically related to the hobo spider's venom. He did a ton of research and had published papers over the years on a variety of topics that still stand. So I certainly don't want to discredit him as a researcher because he did some incredible work. But on this topic, I'm going to read the following passage from the website The Burke Museum, which I have linked in the show notes. It says, quote, "It's been 28 years since my late friend Darwin Vest found severe effects on laboratory rabbits bitten by male hobo spiders. His data led everyone to assume that hobo spiders caused many apparent human spider bite cases. However, over the past quarter century, not one patient has come forward who, 1, was initially healthy, 2, developed the typical hobo spider bite symptoms, and 3, was able to produce any spider that had bitten him or her. Within the range of the brown recluse, genuine necrotic bite patients recover the spider about 20% of the time, so hobo spider victims should have managed it at least once. On the other hand, several humans and dogs developed no significant symptoms when bitten by hobo spiders that were recovered and identified. Some such cases can be explained as, quote, dry bites, but it seems increasingly likely that these hobo spider bite cases, or most of them, are not actually caused by the spider. Biochemical work on the venom and microbiology work on the mouth parts support the idea that hobo spiders are probably harmless. The U.S. Federal Centers for Disease Control recently removed this species from their venomous spiders list. So even though in 2024 we know this to be true, know that in 1999 there was still a large fear of the hobo spiders getting into houses and causing these serious bites. That's an important part of the next part of this story. So now that I've given you the background on the enigma that was Darwin Vest, let's talk a little bit about that night in June of 1999. Remember how I talked about his recommendation that hobo spiders be caught by sticky traps? As it turns out, Darwin was cooking up his own invention, and he was ready to patent his hobo spider traps. On June 2nd, 1999, Darwin Vest had just secured a $6,000 agreement with a local hardware store who was going to sell his traps there. He was so excited. He sent a fax message over to his sister Rebecca that same afternoon. But even more, he was also in negotiations with the big box retailer Fred Meyer. This was going to be even more lucrative in terms of the contract and royalties. So Darwin had much to celebrate about, and he planned to do so by just doing his regular Wednesday routine. Darwin was going to walk to a local bar called the Frosty Gator. On Wednesdays there, he'd meet his best friend, Eric Seneff, and play trivia. They each had different pockets of knowledge, and Darwin's trivia name was Hobo. They won almost every week. Eric Seneff was an antiques dealer, so Vest would often tag along to go to antique shows in the Southwest with Eric. Seneff would be looking for an antique bargain, and Vest would be looking for snakes, spiders, and scorpions. According to an article in the Idaho Statesman, Eric Seneff said, quote, "We'd travel a lot at night, and suddenly he'd tell me to pull over. I hadn't seen a thing, but Darwin did. We'd stop, and he'd get scorpions or snakes. He liked the big, feisty rattlesnakes. He'd tie them up with a rope, put them in a burlap sack, and put them in the trunk," end quote. Okay, sorry, I know I said I was going to stay on track and not talk more Darwin Vest backstory, but the thing is, every time I read an article about him, there's just more and more of these little stories, and I do feel they paint a clearer picture of him and who he was, which is really important when we are left with so many unanswered questions. What we do know about him and who he was can help to piece things together. So that night of June 2nd was extremely rainy and stormy in Idaho Falls. It was windy, and so it was one of those nights where it was blowing sheets of rain in your face if you were outside. Darwin lived about a mile from the bar, and I'll have this all mapped out on the Instagram, at simplertimecrimepod. Despite the crappy weather, Darwin decided to walk, which was not uncommon for him at all. He liked to walk everywhere, so he grabbed his umbrella and headed to trivia night. He and Eric split some pitchers of beer and were later joined by a person named Lee Curtis. Lee was a friend of Darwin's who Eric didn't know as much, and he was just in town visiting. Darwin was said to have not been one who could hold his booze really well. He was a regular beer drinker, but he got tipsy fast. So Eric did say that Darwin, with his celebratory spirit in mind that night, had been drinking and was sufficiently buzzed. When trivia night wrapped up, Eric called it a night and offered to give Darwin a ride home. Darwin declined and said he was going to walk down the road to a place called the Golden Crown Lounge for a nightcap with Lee Curtis. Eric remembers feeling worried about Darwin walking home simply because the weather was so nasty. But Darwin was stubborn and on he went. And everything else, Eric says, was going normal. He was not in any type of weird mood. Nothing was outside of the ordinary. It was just a regular trivia night. Lee Curtis said that he and Darwin went and ordered a beer at the Golden Crown. Lee also recalled that he even ordered Darwin a coffee as well, just to help maybe sober him up a bit, but Darwin didn't drink the coffee. It's unclear just how drunk he was. Again, enough that Lee Curtis thought that a coffee might be a good idea, but Eric Seneff said his concern for Darwin walking home that night was just because of the weather. He wasn't falling down or slurring his words or acting like that impaired. At around 12:30 a.m. on June 3rd, Lee Curtis said that he left the bar temporarily to get cash for a cab. It was almost last call, and they were wrapping up the evening. When he returned, which was possibly up to a half hour later, the bartender let him know that Darwin left. Now, just to help piece this together a bit, because you might think it's weird that Darwin just left, I know I did, but a bartender who was working that night came forward and told police that Lee Curtis went to go to the ATM while Darwin was in the bathroom. So when Darwin came out, he just saw that Lee was gone and figured he had left. This same bartender said that they saw Darwin then just leave via the steps to the alleyway. And from there, Darwin was gone. His mother, Margaret, grew concerned when she was going about her day that next day and Darwin wasn't home. He was a very good communicator and he never left for any significant amount of time without telling her. She called around to people and nobody had seen him. She called his best friend, Eric Seneff, to see if he was possibly with him and that there had just been some sort of miscommunication. Eric and his wife were gone for that day and he didn't get home until very late, but when he did get home, he got the message from Mrs. Vest and was immediately concerned. He called her back and let her know that he hadn't seen Darwin either. From there, Margaret Vest drove in person and filed a missing persons report with the Idaho Falls Police Department. The next day, Eric Seneff came over to be with her, and he was instantly worried when he saw Darwin's car in the driveway. And then it occurred to him he needed to check on the snakes. Yes, you heard me correctly. Eric popped the trunk to Darwin's car, and there was all the confirmation he needed that something terrible had happened to Darwin. Darwin's beloved snakes were still in their enclosures in his trunk. I know that sounds bananas. It did to me too when I first heard it, but apparently he kept his critters everywhere, including in enclosures in the trunk of his car, and Eric Seneff said that Darwin would never have left his snakes uncared for. Police began to trace his walk and talk to people who knew or had spent time with Darwin. One person they really wanted to try to talk to was Lee Curtis, and they were having a hard time tracking him down. It took a few days, and when they did, Lee Curtis had left town. Initially, this seemed suspicious, but if you remember, he was only in town visiting. He would periodically come to Idaho Falls and then return back home. In this case, he left town the next day because of a military-related assignment. Once investigators were able to get a hold of him, he readily agreed to sit down and do an interview. That's where he shared the story of going to the Golden Crown, getting the nightcap, and then leaving for the ATM. He claimed once he saw that Darwin had left, he just got in his cab and left. Police were able to track down the cab driver who verified his story. There was also a female passenger that split the cab as well. One thing about Darwin's disappearance is that there are a lot of partial information pieces on the internet. So one thing you'll see is that there were discrepancies related to the cab ride Lee Curtis took, which sounds way more suspicious than it actually was. What happened is, when police checked the ride logs, they couldn't find this particular ride. Cab companies require logs because ultimately the company takes a percentage of the fare for themselves. So police re-interviewed this cab driver, and he admitted that he just hadn't reported the ride because he wanted to keep all of the fare for himself. So with that, it seems Lee Curtis was not involved. Still, Eric Seneff always held a bit of suspicion. He said in an interview something along the lines of that Darwin would never talk badly about anyone, but he always seemed a bit reserved and unsure of Lee Curtis. But not vibing with someone and that person being harmful are two totally different things. And at this point, there's nothing nefarious that points in the direction of Lee other than he was the last friend to be seen with Darwin. The next lead they looked into was related to a crime that happened a few years prior. Someone had harmed Darwin during a walk home, much like the walk he took on June 3rd. Had this person come back to seek revenge for Darwin putting him in prison? In 1996, a man named Don Ellingford and another man mugged Darwin Vest on his walk home from the bar one evening. Darwin had been walking when Don and his buddies were driving around and saw him. They confronted him and demanded his wallet, but Darwin said no. It was then that they severely beat him up. They beat him unconscious and took his money, where they used it at a local hotel, which was traced. Darwin Vest was seriously injured. After they had beat him up, they just tossed him in a dumpster. And luckily, he regained consciousness on his own. He definitely pressed charges that landed Don Ellingford and his associates in jail. By June of 1999, Don had been released from prison but was staying at a halfway house that was part of a work release program. Initially, Darwin had been angry that law enforcement hadn't made him aware that Don Ellingford had been released from jail so that he could take whatever precautions he felt like he needed. How this place worked was that Don was able to leave and go out to work for the day, but at night he had a curfew, and then the site was locked down. Door alarms, bed checks, the works. Bed checks confirmed that Don was there in the facility that evening and was accounted for at 9:45 p.m. on June 2nd, 2:05 a.m. on June 3rd, and 4:15 a.m. on June 3rd, as well as there that morning when everyone woke up. Don was questioned and said that he hadn't had contact with Darwin since he went to jail and that he was at the facility all evening and had nothing to do with it. One thing of note, somebody else in the same facility did break out the very next day through a window and was on the run for about a year until he was caught. So a lot of people do use this as proof that this facility wasn't the fortress that it claimed to be. Having said that, Ellingford would have had to sneak both out and back into the facility undetected, which is kind of a reach given the small window of time and how he would even have known that Darwin was out and about walking at that time. On December 27th, 2020, Don Ellingford was found shot to death in his trailer in Idaho Falls, so if he did have something to do with Darwin's death, he won't be able to tell us. Next, we have a couple of suspicious sightings amongst the Snake River. The Snake River is a 1,080-mile-long river in the Pacific Northwest. It's the largest tributary of the Columbia River, which is the largest North American river to empty into the Pacific Ocean. The Snake River runs through Idaho Falls and was 2 blocks from the bars Darwin had gone to that night. Many people believe he ended up in the river somehow, either because he walked along the bank looking for spiders and snakes and fell in, or because someone put him there. 2 potential sightings elevated the theory of him falling in the river. The first is another example of Darwin's case that gets lost in the telephone game on the internet. So a police officer who was patrolling said that on the night of June 3rd, 1999 at around 10 p.m., he was patrolling the park that is adjacent to the Snake River. If you Google Maps that area, you'll see there are park benches, and it's said to be a place that sometimes homeless people will go. The police officer said that he asked a very drunk-looking man to move away from the riverbank that night, Many people latched on to that being Darwin, but according to the police log, this was almost a full 24 hours after Darwin was last seen. Remember, he was at the bars on June 2nd, walking home in the wee hours of the morning on June 3rd, and this was all the way later in the darkness of the evening on June 23rd. He was a fixture in town, so if he had pulled some sort of all-nighter and then gone back to day drinking on Thursday the 3rd, he would have been recognized in the bars, particularly in that state. So I really think this person on the riverbank is a red herring that just distracts in this case. But the second sighting is a bit more credible. A woman in the town of Shelley, 9 miles downriver from Idaho Falls, said she was driving over a bridge on June 3rd, 1999, when she saw a man's body floating face down in the river. She actually called police immediately to report it. When they investigated, they found a 50-gallon drum and thought, okay, this must have been what she was mistaking for a man. But when they called her back, she was insistent. I saw a man with dark hair and a red plaid shirt face down in that river. I'm positive it was a man, not a barrel. The thing is, Darwin did have dark hair, but he wasn't wearing a plaid shirt that night. He was wearing almost his go-to uniform people saw him wearing at trivia. He was wearing a black leather jacket, Levi's 501 jeans, a black belt with a snake buckle on it, which I'll have a picture of on the Instagram, and a watch with a spider on it, also on the Instagram. When she first reported this, Darwin hadn't been reported missing yet, so they hadn't put two and two together. But as time passed, investigators wondered if this really could have been Darwin. The woman was re-interviewed several times and was emphatic about what she saw and never wavered. Still, a body was never recovered, and even when they went out to recover the drum, there were no signs of a human out there in the water. Darwin's friends and family find it unlikely that he would fall into the water. His friend Eric Seneff said that if Eric ended up in the water, it wouldn't be because Eric fell in. Eric's wife was also interviewed and said, quote, "He always walked home the same way, and his route from the bar to his mother's house wouldn't have taken him within 2 blocks of the river, and he would have had to have crossed a busy street to get there. Why would he have gone 2 blocks out of his way and crossed a street to get to a river at that hour on a rainy night when all he wanted to do was go home and go to bed?" End quote. Another thing about the river is that his body is never washed up. Unfortunately, people do drown in the Snake River each year, and most bodies resurface. I was researching his case and came across a local Redditor from several years ago. This person with the username Clyde2003 said, quote, "This is my hometown, and when it happened, the rumor mill was wide open. I'm in the camp that thinks he ended up in the river. The thing about this stretch of the Snake River is that it is rutted with deep fissures from the basalt lava beds that cover southern Idaho. His body could have easily lodged into a hole and stayed there. Be sure, if it didn't end up there, it would have ended up on the intake screens of the power plant that's not far down the river from where that bar is. They find at least 1 or 2 bodies a year on that screen." End quote. So that was useful information to me about why his body wouldn't have resurfaced if it got stuck in one of those holes. It also tells me that if this local person is accurate, his body would have washed up on the power plant intake screens, which would have made it unlikely, if not impossible, for him to be floating 9 miles down in Shelley, Idaho, since this power plant is before that. But let's say for a second that his body did get lodged in one of those holes in the river. What about his umbrella? I'm with Eric Seneff's wife. Why is he even detouring anywhere on a crazy weather night when his family said he hated the rain? That's not going to be the ideal search for snakes and spiders kind of night. And say he slipped and fell. Is he going to keep gripping his umbrella? Either he fell in and the umbrella would wash up, or it wouldn't have fallen in with him and it would be on the side of that riverbank. I can't find anything that provides me any information on this, so without any further explanation, that's a huge hang-up of mine relating to the river accident theory. Police felt pretty sure he ended up in the river, but without a body, they kept his cold case open, hoping for a clue. In 2008, an inmate came forward stating they had information about who killed Darwin Vest and why. This man, who I'll call Joe, said that his fellow inmate, who I'll call Rick, told them that one day when they were out at the bars, Darwin grabbed Rick in his genital area, and that Rick was so angry he wanted revenge on Darwin. Rick was not in prison at the time of Darwin's disappearance and didn't have any strong alibi, but he denied having anything to do with Darwin's disappearance. Rick said that he recalled seeing Darwin out before. Again, Darwin was kind of a community fixture, but he denied the whole story about the inappropriate touching or a feud. He said the other inmate had made that whole thing up to try to lighten his own sentence, so nothing ever came of that. And that's pretty much it. Darwin's case is cold. It's still open, and he is the king of hearts on the Idaho cold case playing card deck. Margaret Vest, Darwin's mother, hoped more than anything to stay alive long enough to find out what happened to him. But unfortunately, she died in 2011 at the age of 83. She had remained in her home, leaving Darwin's things and hoping for his return for many, many years. 7 years after his disappearance, his sister Rebecca was interviewed about his disappearance, and she discussed the grief she has lived in since Darwin went missing, and how not knowing has impacted her life. This interview really solidified my desire to cover this case, and I hope more than anything she gets answers in her lifetime. Rebecca said, quote, "Since I was a little girl, he was teaching me about snakes and spiders and venomous fish and sea life. We always had these amazing specimens around. I thought he was invincible, having done all this research and handled venomous snakes that would kill you if they grazed you with a fang. It's unimaginable that he's gone. If we could just know what happened, that's all I hope for." If you have any information on the disappearance of Darwin Vest, please contact the Idaho Cold Case Tip Line at 1-844-TIP-4040. This has been another week of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe to the podcast on your preferred listening platform, give the podcast a 5-star review, and tell your friends. You can follow the podcast on social media on Instagram at simplertimecrimepod, on TikTok, and on Facebook. And join me next Monday as I dive into another unsolved case. Thank you so much for listening.